Well, welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. In today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 21, verse 30, which reads, "There is no wisdom, no insight, and no plan that can succeed against the Lord." The reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because, let's be honest, right? History is full of people who were convinced they had figured out a way to beat God. For example, Pharaoh decided he could ignore the God of a nation of slaves and keep them in bondage indefinitely. Nebuchadnezzar decided his own greatness was self-generated and accountable to no one above him. The builders of Babel decided they can construct their way to a position of permanent security independent of divine authority. So in every case, the plan looks solid from the inside, and in every case, it did not hold, right? And so we do not always recognize, though, the modern versions of this because they rarely announce themselves with the kind of dramatic framing that we see in the Bible, right? Nobody sits down and says, I'm going to devise a plan against God today, right? The opposition to God's purposes tends to be much quieter than that. It looks like the gradual construction of a life organized around our own wisdom rather than His. It looks like systems, institutions, and ideologies that operate as if God is either irrelevant or conquerable. It looks like the slow accumulation of human confidence that we have finally figured out enough to operate independently. And Proverbs 21:30 addresses all of it with one of the most sweeping and unqualified statements in the entire book. Not some wisdom, not most plans, not certain kinds of insight, right? None of it succeeds against the Lord. And so the comprehensiveness of the claim is the point. And so let's break down the verse now, right? There is no wisdom, no insight, no plan. Right, the triple repetition at the opening of this verse is deliberate and worth noticing. Solomon does not say there is no wisdom against the Lord and leave it there. He says wisdom, then insight, then plan. Three distinct categories, each one listed separately, as if Solomon is systematically closing every possible door through which human opposition to God might attempt to enter. We got wisdom, chokmah. We know very well by this point in our series, right? The practical skill of living and navigating reality effectively. Here, Solomon is acknowledging that human wisdom can be very impressive, right? It produces real results in the horizontal domain of human affairs. The best strategists, the most capable leaders, the most perceptive thinkers throughout history have demonstrated what human wisdom at its highest level can accomplish. And Solomon is saying that none of it, at its very best, can succeed against the Lord. And then we have insight, tavuna, which is the perceptive discernment that sees beneath the surface of things. Again, a real and valuable human capacity. The person of insight sees what others miss, reads situations accurately, understands dynamics that are invisible to less perceptive observers. And so Solomon is not dismissing this capacity at all. He's locating its ceiling. Right, there is a point beyond which even the sharpest human insight cannot see, and that point is exactly where God's purposes are operating. Then we have plan, eitzah, the same word we encountered back in Proverbs 19:21 as God's own prevailing purpose. And here it describes human strategic planning, the deliberate construction of a course of action designed to achieve a specific outcome. Right, plans can be sophisticated, carefully researched, and brilliantly executed. They can account for countless variables and contingencies, and not one of them, when positioned against the Lord, will succeed. But I also think that the comprehensiveness of the three terms is the argument, right? Solomon is not leaving a category of human intellectual or strategic capacity unaddressed. Whatever form our opposition to God takes, whether it's the broadly wise, the perceptively insightful, or the carefully planned, the verdict is identical. It does not succeed. And this is also where the verse needs its most important clarification, because it's easy to misread, right? Proverbs 21:30 is not saying that wisdom, insight, and planning are worthless. The entire book of Proverbs is actually an extended argument for the pursuit of all three. Well, what the verse is saying is that these things, when deployed against the Lord, when used in opposition to His purposes, or in the construction of a life that excludes Him, find a ceiling they cannot break through. And so the problem is not the capacities themselves, it is their direction. So Psalm 2, right, is the most extended poetic treatment of this same reality in all of Scripture. And reading it alongside Proverbs 21:30 is really just profound, right? It says this, the psalm opens with a rhetorical question. Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. And so the plotting and taking counsel is exactly the wisdom, insight, and planning of Proverbs 21:30 deployed against God. And the divine response in verse 4 is one of the most arresting images in the Psalms. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. And so the laugh is not cruelty, right? It's a natural response of infinite power and wisdom to the spectacle of finite opposition. The plans do not register as a genuine threat. They register as, at best, a temporary disturbance in an outcome that was never actually in question. And then back in Isaiah 8:10, he captures the same principle in the prophetic context. Take counsel together, but it will come to nothing. Speak a word, but it will not stand, for God is with us. Right? And so the counsel comes to nothing, not because it was a poorly constructed, but because it was constructed against the one whose purposes will prevail. And Isaiah 46:10 later in the book gives us the widest possible statement of God's unassailable position, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. And so my counsel shall stand is the positive version of what Proverbs 21:30 states negatively. No opposing plan succeeds because God's plan already occupies the territory where every opposing plan would need to establish itself. The New Testament adds the most theologically decisive layer to this principle. 1 Corinthians 1:18-20 addresses the specific form of wisdom that was being deployed against the gospel in Paul's day. The intellectual sophistication of Greek philosophy and the religious tradition of Jewish law, and concludes with one of the most striking reversals in the New Testament. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. And so even God's apparent foolishness exceeds the best of human wisdom. The cross, which looked like the ultimate defeat of God's purposes to everyone watching, turned out to be the mechanism of their greatest triumph. The wisdom, insight, and plan of those who crucified Jesus was the most dramatic illustration in history of Proverbs 21:30. They thought they had won, but they had not even come close. Let me get the next part of the verse. That can succeed against the Lord. The phrase succeed against is the critical qualifier that shapes the entire verse. Solomon is not saying human wisdom, insight, and planning are universally ineffective, but he is saying that they cannot succeed when they are positioned against the Lord, right? The preposition carries the weight of the whole claim. And so this means that the verse is not an argument for intellectual passivity or the abandonment of careful thinking, but it is an argument about the ultimate ceiling of human opposition to God. Within the domain of human affairs, wisdom produces real results. Plans succeed, insight confers genuine advantage, right? And so the verse does not deny any of that. But what it does deny is the possibility that any of it, however sophisticated, can ultimately prevail when it is in opposition to the one who created the framework within which all human activity takes place. I love Job 38-41. I think it's one of the most extended biblical treatments of the gap between human understanding and divine authority. God's response to Job from the whirlwind is essentially a sustained, specific demonstration of the principle behind Proverbs 21:30. He says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? It's not a cruel dismissal of Job's intelligence, but it is a precise calibration of where human wisdom stands in relation to divine wisdom. Job's wisdom was real, and his integrity was genuine as well, but the gap between his best understanding and God's actual operation of reality was still immeasurable. And so with all that being said, I want to get practical now, and I want to get applicable because, as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that turning knowledge into action is one of the most important parts of our Christian walk. And so the first thing is to let this verse recalibrate our confidence when we are tempted to manage life on our own terms. I think the most personally relevant application of Proverbs 21:30 is not about dramatic opposition to God. It's about the quieter, more ordinary version of the same impulse, the tendency to construct our lives according to our own wisdom, insight, and planning without genuinely submitting those things to God. And so every time we make a significant decision based purely on our own assessment of the situation, every time we pursue a direction that we have determined is right without bringing it honestly before God, we are operating in the territory reality that this verse addresses. Not in a dramatic Pharaoh-like way, but in the mundane, daily way that accumulates into a life organized around our own wisdom rather than God's. And Proverbs 33, 5-6 remains the practical antidote. Do not lean on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways. Right? The confidence this verse forbids is not confidence in general. It is the specific confidence that our plans, however well constructed they are, can succeed independently of the God against whom no plan succeeds. Second thing, find genuine comfort in this verse when human opposition to what is right seems to be winning. Proverbs 21:30 is not only a warning, it is also a comfort, and perhaps its most important application is in that direction. Because when we watch injustice apparently prevailing, right, when people with powerful plans opposed to what is good and true seem to be succeeding, when the wisdom of the world appears to be outmaneuvering the purposes of God in some visible arena, this verse provides the stable ground under the anxiety that no plan against the Lord will succeed ultimately. The laugh that we see in Psalm 2 is not distant or hypothetical, but it is the settled response of the one who sees the end from the beginning and knows exactly how the story ends. Holding on to this truth in seasons in our life where it does not appear to be empirically obvious is an act of genuine faith, the kind that Hebrews 11:1 describes as the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. And so the third thing is to just submit our wisdom, insight, and planning to God rather than deploying them independently. Right? The practical synthesis of this verse for those who want to live wisely is not the abandonment of wisdom, insight, and planning. It is their reorientation. The same capacities that cannot succeed against the Lord can genuinely be fruitful when they are submitted to him and aligned with his purpose rather than opposed to them. And Proverbs 16:3 gives us the practical expression of this. Commit your work to the Lord and your plans will be established. Right? The establishing of plans is the positive outcome available to the person who submits their planning to God rather than operating independently of him. Right? Our wisdom, insight, and planning were never meant to be deployed against the Lord. They were meant to be offered to him, shaped by his word, and submitted to his purposes, at which point they become genuinely useful rather than ultimately futile. So let me just give a closing thought here. Proverbs 21:30 is just one of the most quietly confident verses in all of Scripture. It does not argue. It does not qualify. It does not offer exceptions or nuance to claim for edge cases, but it simply states what is true about the relationship between human opposition and divine sovereignty as a settled fact. No wisdom, no insight, no plan, none of it succeeds against the Lord. And that truth cuts in two directions simultaneously. It's a warning to anyone who is constructing a life, a system, or a strategy that positions itself against God's purposes. And it is a profound comfort to anyone who is watching such plans appear to succeed in the short term. The laugh of heaven is not impatient, for it knows something the planners do not, and the outcome was never actually in question.